18 points. Let that number sit for a second. Not 4, not 6, not the kind of margin you chalk up to a hot shooting night or a bad defensive effort you forget about by morning. 18. Against a team that every analyst, every media outlet, every championship conversation this offseason has already handed the 2026 title to before a single regular season game has even tipped off. Against a New York Liberty roster stacked with Jonquel Jones, Breanna Stewart, and Sabrina Ionescu, 3 players who individually would be the best player on most other rosters in this league, Indiana walked into Barclays Center in Brooklyn into what was essentially a Liberty home game and won by 18 points. And before you reach for the "it's just preseason" argument, hold on, because the circumstances surrounding this game make that rationalization nearly impossible to stand behind. Caitlin Clark played her first meaningful basketball in months. Sophie Cunningham was suiting up for the first time since a structural knee injury ended her 2025 season before it ever found its footing. Aliyah Boston wasn't in uniform. Lexi Hall was watching from the bench in street clothes. Indiana came into Brooklyn short-handed, banged up, and still operating on limited competitive rhythm after an offseason of rehabilitation work, and they left with an 18-point victory over the team the entire league had already coronated. That is not a result you scroll past. That is not a box score you file under "small sample, move on." That is a direct, loud, undeniable statement about where the power structure of this league might actually be heading. And if you've been waiting all offseason to find out whether this Indiana roster was truly rebuilt or just rebuilt on paper, you're exactly where you need to be right now. Here is everything that happened at Barclays Center, what it actually means, and why the 2026 championship conversation just became significantly more complicated than anyone expected it to be 2 weeks before the regular season opens. Let's start with Caitlin Clark, because a significant portion of the coverage around her return has been glossing over just how bad 2025 actually was. Not softening it, not putting it in proper context, genuinely glossing over it in a way that makes what she did against New York harder to appreciate without the full picture. So here is the full picture. Clark played 13 games in 2025. Not 13 games before a precautionary shutdown at the end of the year to preserve her for the playoffs, not 13 strong outings out of a full regular season slate where she was dealing with something manageable. 13 total, the entire year. Her body kept sending her back to the training room over and over and over again while the season moved forward without her. And the nature of how it happened is what makes it genuinely difficult to process from the outside. The quad went first. That was the original problem, the one that started the cascade. And if it had just been the quad, a clean injury with a clear recovery window and a straightforward return to play progression, this would have been a different story. Athletes come back from quad injuries. It's painful, it requires patience, it requires the training staff to manage the load carefully, but it's a knowable problem with a predictable path forward. That path never materialized cleanly. Before she ever got right from the quad, ankle issues compounded the situation. A different problem, a different set of muscles and joints and movement patterns that needed to be addressed, stacking on top of a recovery that was already underway. And then in July, before the ankle had resolved the way it needed to, a groin injury stepped in and finished off whatever was left of her season. Quad, then ankle, then groin. 3 entirely separate structural problems, each one interrupting a recovery that hadn't been completed from the one before it. That specific pattern, the interrupted recovery cycle, creates something that a single serious injury does not. There's a particular kind of psychological damage that happens when your body keeps pulling you back just when you think you're getting closer to feeling normal again. One major injury is devastating, but it has a defined arc. You understand what happened, you understand what has to heal, and while the process is hard and long, there's a clarity to it that lets you mentally organize around the recovery. What Clark went through in 2025 had no clarity. Every time she started trending in the right direction, something new shut the door.
The trust she was trying to rebuild in her own body kept getting interrupted before it could consolidate, and that matters in ways that don't show up on medical clearance paperwork.
Here's something that gets missed in almost every conversation about athlete recoveries. Physical clearance and psychological clearance are two completely separate milestones, and they frequently don't arrive at the same time. You can be medically cleared, the imaging looks clean, the strength tests check out, the training staff signs off, and still be playing with a layer of hesitation underneath every movement that the untrained eye can't see, but that absolutely affects your performance. Athletes returning from significant injury, especially recurring injury, will often unconsciously protect the area that kept failing them even after it's healed. They'll land slightly differently. They'll decelerate a half step earlier than they used to. They'll pull back on a drive they would have attacked without thinking in the year before everything broke down. You can't simply decide to trust a quad that kept failing you or push off an ankle you spent weeks protecting. That trust has to be rebuilt through repetition under competitive conditions. And it takes time that no amount of training camp work or preseason preparation can fully compress. Which is what made what Clark did against the Liberty so significant. Not just the stats, the way she did it. 0 turnovers. That is the number from Clark's 17 minutes against New York that demands the most careful attention. Not the 7 points, not the 4 assists, not even the step-back three-pointer that had Indiana's fan base exhaling from coast to coast. 0 turnovers. Against a full-court pressure scheme that New York came in with specifically designed to force quick, uncomfortable decisions from a player who hadn't competed at this level since her injury spiral shut her down months earlier. Think about what the Liberty were trying to do here. This wasn't a passive defensive approach. This was a game-planned attack on Clark's vulnerabilities as a returning player. Push her early, get the ball out of her hands in awkward positions, make her feel like 2025 never ended, like her body was still the unreliable thing it spent most of last season being. Force her into the rushed reads and loose possessions that come naturally when a player hasn't yet rebuilt full trust in her own processing speed under competitive pressure. That was the scheme. And Clark gave them nothing to work with. She ran the offense. She found the correct play on each possession. She read the pressure and made the right decision before the defense could create the mistake it was hunting for. She never got sped up. She never forced anything. She didn't retreat into the cautious, protect yourself style of play that returning players often default to, pulling back from contact, avoiding the drives that could put her in harm's way, prioritizing self-preservation over winning plays. She also didn't overcorrect in the other direction, the way players sometimes do when they're trying to prove something, attacking recklessly and manufacturing chances to show everyone they're back. Clark did neither of those things. She simply played basketball the right way, which after everything she went through in 2025 is arguably the most impressive thing she could have done. Coach Stephanie White was asked about Clark postgame, and what she said is worth paying attention to carefully. By the time the 2026 preseason arrived, White noted that Clark carried herself visibly differently than she had during the difficult stretches of 2025. The joy was back. Not performed joy, not the kind of enthusiasm a player puts on for the cameras during training camp media availability. Genuine, visible, from the sideline joy. A player moving with real confidence instead of one who was still testing herself carefully with every single possession. White described it postgame as Clark playing with great intention in everything she did. And if you understand what that phrase means coming from a coach watching a player return from this kind of layoff, it's one of the more meaningful things you could hear. The floater dropped clean. That detail matters more than it might seem. A floater is a touch shot. It's not a power move. It's not a catch and shoot where your mechanics do most of the work automatically. A floater requires the quad to fire correctly, the ankle to be fully stable, the body's momentum to be properly controlled, and the timing to hold steady despite contact or defensive interference. It is among the first skills that disappear when a player's body isn't fully cooperating with what their mind is asking it to do, because it requires a level of physical trust and muscle memory precision that breaks down quickly when confidence is low. And Clark's floater dropped clean. Not lucky, not off the grass, not the kind of shot that goes in but makes you nervous watching it leave her hand. Clean. In that moment, the recovery narrative stopped being a story people were telling,
and became a confirmed, visible fact in real time.
Then she hit the three, the step back, pull up, deep three, and the quiet fear that nobody in Indiana's fan base had been willing to say out loud, that the pull-up range from deep might not return completely clean after months of protecting a bad ankle and managing a compromised quad. That fear got answered on the spot. Clark finished 1 for 5 from 3 overall, but she said post-game that her misses were running long. Her legs are fully under her. She's simply recalibrating her feel for distance after the extended layoff, which is exactly what you want to hear from a deep shooter in week 1 of the preseason. Her legs are there. The range is there. The rest is just repetitions. 17 minutes, 7 points, 4 assists, 3 rebounds, 0 turnovers, against a defensive scheme built to generate exactly that. The question about whether Caitlin Clark was truly back got answered in Brooklyn, and the answer was not complicated. But here's the thing, and this might be the part of this game that is being most dramatically underreported. While Clark's return was consuming every broadcast introduction, every social media post, and every pregame storyline heading into tip-off, Sophie Cunningham quietly went out and put up 14 points in 13 minutes on 3 three-pointers. And if you understand what a meniscal tear actually does to a shooter at the structural and mechanical level, those numbers are not just impressive, they're almost hard to believe. Less than a year before she stood on that floor at Barclays Center and started knocking down threes against the New York Liberty, her knee had a structural tear in it. And a meniscal tear isn't just painful. It isn't just a recovery timeline you have to manage and wait through. It changes the fundamental movement patterns that basketball demands from your body. It changes how you plant your foot coming off a screen. It changes how you cut toward the ball. It changes how you load your legs in the split second before you release a rhythm three-pointer. It changes the micro movements that happen in your lower body before your shooting hand even touches the ball. The movements you've been doing automatically, without thinking about them, since you were a teenager learning how to play the game at a high level. Cunningham's entire offensive game runs directly through those movements. She is not a player who creates off the dribble and manufactures her own shots in isolation. She plays on the arc, coming off curl cuts, catching the ball in rhythm from movement, and firing before a closeout can arrive and contest the shot. Every single one of those actions, the curl, the catch, the plant, the release, requires her knee to respond instantly and without any compensating hesitation. Not just without pain, which is a lower bar, without hesitation. Because a shooter who's even slightly uncertain about how her knee is going to respond when she plants and elevates will alter her release point, adjust her timing, hold back a fraction of a second waiting for confirmation that it's okay. And all of those micro adjustments compound into a shot that doesn't go in at the same rate it used to. She spent the better part of a year retraining that knee to do exactly what she was asking of it. Not just healing it, retraining it. Building the muscle memory back from the ground up so that when a curl cut presented itself in a live game, her body wouldn't hesitate, it would just move. When she posted from New York before tip-off, saying she had been dying to say it was finally game day and that feeling healthy felt enormous, that wasn't routine preseason excitement talking. That was 11 months of rehabilitation work trying to speak for itself through a social media post the morning of a game. The first 3 dropped clean. The second 3 dropped clean. The third 3 dropped clean. Each one of those shots was a physical confirmation, in real time, in front of a crowd, against live competition in a game that mattered, that the retraining she had put in since January actually held when pressure was applied. It's one thing to shoot clean threes in practice. It's a completely different thing to plant off a curl cut with a defender closing out hard and trust your knee completely in that moment when your body knows from recent memory what happens when that knee fails. Cunningham trusted it 3 times, and 3 times it responded exactly the way 11 months of work was designed to make it respond. 17 minutes, 7 points, 4 assists, 3 rebounds, 0 turnovers, against a defensive scheme built to generate exactly that. The question about whether Caitlin Clark was truly back got answered in Brooklyn, and the answer was not complicated.
But here's the thing, and this might be the part of this game that is being most dramatically underreported. While Clark's return was consuming every broadcast introduction, every social media post, and every pre-game storyline heading into tip-off, Sophie Cunningham quietly went out and put up 14 points in 13 minutes on 3 three-pointers. And if you understand what a meniscal tear actually does to a shooter at the structural and mechanical level, those numbers are not just impressive, they're almost hard to believe. Indiana came into Brooklyn short-handed. That's not spin, that's just what happened. Aliyah Boston, one of the most important players on this roster, was managing a lower leg issue and never got into uniform. Lexi Hall, who brings floor spacing and transition capability to a system built to run, was watching the game from the bench due to hamstring tightness. White confirmed post-game that both players would have dressed and contributed minutes if the contest had actually counted in the standings. It didn't, it's the preseason, so Indiana made the decision to protect them, load manage 2 significant rotation pieces, and still sent a shorter, less than full-strength lineup onto the floor against the New York Liberty in the Liberty's building.
The bench scored 62 points against the Liberty, against a team constructed specifically with the length, the defensive intelligence, and the rotational awareness to make 62 bench points feel like a theoretical exercise rather than an actual achievable number. 62 points from reserves against a roster that was built piece by piece to prevent exactly that kind of output from second and third unit players. That number doesn't get rationalized away with small sample caveats. You don't score 62 points off your bench against Jonquel Jones and Breanna Stewart's defense because of a hot shooting night. You do it because your reserve unit is genuinely, structurally, competitively better than the opposition expected. And the manner in which that bench production arrived matters as much as the total itself. Shakira Walker-Kimbrough's most important contribution, 9 of her 18 points, came specifically during a 21-4 fourth-quarter run that created the final decisive separation between these two teams. A 21-4 run doesn't happen because one player gets hot. It happens because an entire unit is executing on both ends of the floor simultaneously, generating defensive stops, converting those stops into transition opportunities, and finishing those opportunities before the defense can recover and reset. Walker-Kimbrough was finishing what the defense was creating. That is a team basketball play, not an individual one. And it came from the bench unit in the fourth quarter of a game the Liberty had every structural reason to win. This is what the 62 bench points actually represent. Not randomness, not a night where everything happened to fall right. A bench unit that is capable of sustaining pressure, maintaining intensity, and converting defensive execution into offensive production for 40 minutes against one of the best rosters in the league. That is a depth story, and it is one of the most underrated elements of what Indiana is building right now. Raven Johnson deserves her own dedicated section because what she did in 17 minutes of floor time against the Liberty speaks directly to the structural question that opposing coaches across this league are going to be wrestling with all season long. 8 assists in 17 minutes, without turnovers to offset them, without blown assignments that created defensive problems on the other end, without any of the sloppy play that can make a high assist game look better than it actually was. Johnson delivered the ball cleanly, in rhythm, to players who could do something with it, and she did it against a New York defense that was actively trying to prevent exactly that kind of ball movement. Her length is the starting point for understanding why she creates the problems she creates. It's not just a description of her physical dimensions, it's a precise explanation of how she physically accesses passing angles and intercepts ball movement that guards of standard size simply cannot reach. When the Liberty ran their half-court sets and tried to generate offense in the half-court, Johnson's extended arms converted possessions that should have been stable New York opportunities into Indiana transition situations before the Liberty's offensive players could even fully process that the ball was gone. That's not defensive effort. That's physical capability doing something that effort alone can't replicate. But the more important element of Johnson's game, the one that has broader implications for how Indiana functions as a whole, is what happens when Clark sits. Because one of the questions about this roster heading into the regular season is whether Indiana's offensive and defensive tempo is tied directly to Clark being on the floor, or whether it's a system-wide identity that holds regardless of who's running the point. Against the Liberty, that question got answered. When Clark came off the floor, Johnson ran the second unit, and the tempo didn't drop. The defensive pressure didn't ease. Indiana didn't shift into a more conservative, protect-the-lead mode while their starter rested. They kept going. Same pace, same aggression, same conversion rate from defensive stops to transition offense. The Liberty got no rest from Indiana's pressure when Clark sat, because Johnson runs the same system at the same speed. This is where White's stated vision for this team stops being a preseason talking point and starts being a visible, measurable reality. 29 transition points came directly from 24 New York turnovers. The defense was creating the offense, not in the abstract way coaches talk about it in training camp, but in a specific, trackable, possession-by-possession way that showed up in the box score and on the film. Indiana's active defense forced Liberty half-court possessions into live ball situations and then finished them on the other end so quickly that New York's defense was scrambling to recover before it even had time to organize. Indiana had 8 blocks as a team. They scored 32 points in the first quarter alone. The Liberty's full-court pressure scheme, which was specifically designed to disrupt Indiana's offensive flow and make Clark uncomfortable, got turned around on them so completely that it was New York that ended up playing at Indiana's pace rather than the other way around. That is what White built, and the Liberty game was the first real competition test of whether the personnel she assembled could actually execute it for 40 minutes against a legitimate opponent. They could.
Before we go deeper on what the rest of this roster showed at Barclays, and there's a lot to cover here, let's acknowledge that Kelsey Mitchell's night is one of the most quietly impressive individual performances that came out of this game. 18 points, 7 of 12 from the field in 17 minutes of floor time. And the way those numbers arrived is what matters. Mitchell was not hunting shots. She was not forcing up volume attempts to get hers in a game where the storylines were built around other players. She made the right play on each possession, found her spots within Indiana's offensive flow, and let the points arrive naturally from a system that rewards correct decisions rather than individual shot creation. 7 of 12 is a highly efficient shooting line in any context. In 17 minutes, against the Liberty's defense, with multiple other offensive options demanding attention on the same floor, it becomes a statement about what Mitchell is capable of when she's operating inside a structure that fits her strengths. Michaela Onyenwere added 11 points off the bench, continued to demonstrate why White has trusted her in this rotation, even as the roster has gotten deeper and more talented around her. And then there's Justine Pox, a 6'4" shooter who is still working her way into a full role within Indiana's system, but flashed something in this game that opposing defenses are going to have to add to their preparation before the regular season starts. 8 points from the perimeter. Range from distance from a 6'4" player who can pull up from deep and make it. If you think carefully about what that specific combination creates for a defense, a player that tall who can operate comfortably from three-point range, it generates a very specific problem that compounds every time Indiana puts multiple players of that size and range on the arc at the same time. Opposing defenses now have to assign a perimeter-capable defender to someone they would normally try to body up in the paint or switch under on the perimeter. When Indiana runs multiple players of Pox's size and range on the arc at the same time, the defensive rotation complexity multiplies with every action run. A screen and roll that was manageable with one player of that profile becomes significantly harder to defend when there are 2 or 3. Coaches across this league now have to factor Pox into their scouting preparation for Indiana in a way that wasn't necessary before this game. That is a concrete addition to what Indiana can do offensively, not just a box score curiosity from one preseason game.
Now let's talk about Monique Billings, because she is a specific reason why Indiana's front court could sustain the pace this team is built to run at, and the Kelsey to Billings connection in transition is something the Liberty never found a reliable answer for throughout this game. Billings and Walker Kimbrough are not traditional post players in the conventional sense. They don't secure a defensive rebound and hold their position while the guards set up the play and the offense organizes in the half court. They run the floor immediately, rim to rim, and they do it with the timing and the hands clean enough that Clark can hit them in full stride without slowing the transition pace down while the big catches up. 9 points and 7 rebounds from Billings in a game where her most significant contribution may have been the tempo she helped Indiana maintain in transition. Every time she ran the floor and gave Clark a target ahead of the defense, it forced New York's defenders to make a choice: rotate back to stop the easy basket at the rim, or stay connected to their perimeter assignments and trust the big defender to handle it. There is no good answer to that choice when the guard delivering the ball is Caitlin Clark and the target running the floor is a front court player with clean enough hands to catch it at full speed. Indiana exploited that problem repeatedly in the first half, built a lead from it, and never gave New York a genuine opportunity to climb back. That is a different kind of front court than most teams in this league are building, and it showed up directly in the score. Here is the part of this conversation that should actually concern the Liberty's coaching staff and front office as they go back to the film. And I mean genuinely concern them, not in the way you dismiss a preseason result with qualifications about roster health and game intensity, but in the structural way that should shape how they build their preparation for when these two teams see each other again. The Indiana roster that beat New York by 18 points at Barclays Center was not at full strength. Aliyah Boston will return to a rotation that functioned at a high level without her. Boston is not a role player on this team. She is a central piece of how Indiana operates in the half court, a player who can score, rebound, defend, and protect the paint in ways that expand the team's ceiling significantly. She was not available in Brooklyn, and Indiana still won by 18. Lexie Hall will add another floor spacer to a team that already showed it could stretch opposing defenses from the perimeter with multiple players simultaneously. Lexie's ability to run in transition and create space from the wing in pace and space systems is exactly the kind of addition that makes the team's offensive actions harder to guard when she's healthy and available. She was watching from the bench in street clothes, and Indiana still won by 18.
The system White built does not have a slow gear. It does not have a conservative mode. It does not have a plan B that functions at a lower level of intensity when the top of the rotation isn't available. What the Liberty saw at Barclays Center, the pressure, the pace, the transition offense, the bench depth, the defensive conversion rate, was Indiana's floor. The ceiling involves those two players returning to full health and finding their rhythm within what the team already showed it can do without them. The ceiling involves Clark and Cunningham continuing to build competitive rhythm over the next 2 preseason games before everything that happens actually counts. The ceiling involves this group developing the kind of collective chemistry that separates a talented roster from a cohesive, playoff-tested unit. None of that was fully on display yet in Brooklyn. What was on display was already enough to win by 18. That is the sentence the Liberty staff is sitting with right now. Before the Barclays Center game, the 2026 WNBA championship conversation started in New York, and for most of the league's observers, it ended there too. The Liberty's roster construction, the returning core, the pieces added in the offseason, it all pointed to a team that had addressed the gaps from their previous run and was positioned to be better than they'd ever been. Most of the serious analysts in this space had moved on from the who can challenge New York question and were already debating specifics about the playoff bracket. That was a reasonable position to hold coming into the preseason. It is a much harder position to hold coming out of it. Pull back and look at the complete picture from one game. Indiana beat the predetermined 2026 WNBA champions by 18 points without 2 rotation players in uniform. Clark produced 0 turnovers in 17 minutes under a defensive scheme built specifically to generate exactly that outcome.
Raven Johnson made the Liberty's half-court offense look disorganized from the guard position. 29 transition points came directly from 24 New York turnovers, with Indiana's defense creating the offensive opportunities rather than waiting for them to develop. The bench unit scored 62 points against a roster constructed with defensive infrastructure to make that number theoretically impossible. The Liberty's length and defensive awareness, the core competitive advantages that everyone said made New York the answer to Indiana's pace, were not the answer on this particular night, not even close. The question this game answered is no longer whether Indiana can compete at the championship level. That question is settled. The question this game opened, the one that the next 2 preseason games and the entire regular season will be working toward answering, is how far this roster actually goes when everyone is healthy and every game counts. How high is the ceiling on a team that showed this much at the floor? 2 preseason games remain. April 30th at home against Dallas, then May 2nd against the Nigeria women's national team before the regular season opens and everything that happens has consequences. Each one of those games is another opportunity for Clark and Cunningham to build competitive rhythm, another chance for White to sharpen the rotational decisions and lineup combinations that will matter when a 7-game playoff series is on the line, and another chance for this group to develop the collective trust and chemistry that comes from real competition rather than practice repetitions. The Indiana Fever are not a sleeper pick anymore. They are not a team you mention as an afterthought when you're asked who might challenge the Liberty. After what happened at Barclays Center on this night, they are a legitimate part of the 2026 WNBA championship conversation. And anyone who watched that game carefully, who looked at the context around it and understood what Clark's 0 turnovers meant, what Cunningham's 3 clean threes meant, what 62 bench points meant against that specific defense, what Raven Johnson's 8 assists in 17 minutes meant for how this team functions with and without its star on the floor. Anyone who processed all of that honestly cannot argue otherwise with serious intellectual effort. Before Brooklyn, this was New York's to lose. After Brooklyn, Indiana is here, and the regular season hasn't even started yet.